Let's go ahead and cover my top 5 players to watch heading into Division B. Division B kicks off this Monday, February 18th. Now, starting off at number 5, take my vamos. It is Lucky from Team Heretics. Heretics came out at the PLQ and proved a lot to the entire Call of Duty Esports community. Because in past, right, we've known certain international teams to be good at one particular game mode, and that has been Search and Destroy. Australian teams since Call of Duty Ghost Champs have been known as the Search and Destroy teams. We've known to look out for them in that particular way. And Heretics, they rewrote the script. They dominated in the respawns. At the play-in qualifier, they went 11-4 in respawns in their group. They had the second best win percentage in Hardpoint, just behind Enigma 6 with a 78% overall. The team was playing incredibly fast-paced and constantly were catching people off guard. That was the main topic that everyone on the analyst desk, everyone on Twitter, Reddit posts, they were talking about. Heretics are great at respawns, and they fly at you. They are constantly in your face, and really the stats go to show that as well. To put in perspective how fast they were in respawn, they hold 3 players in the top 4 and 4 players in the top 12 for engagements per minute out of everyone at the PLQ. Now, more specifically, I want to cover the main man, Lucky, right? The coach, or not the coach of the team, but the captain of the team. He put up a performance at the PLQ. In Hardpoint, he was 13th. Search and Destroy, he was 8th. Control, he was 4th. And he was 8th overall with a 1.28 KD. This isn't something that we're used to seeing, right? This isn't something that we're used to seeing from an international talent to be involved constantly in the top 10 for almost every single game mode. It's incredibly impressive, and it's really about time, to be totally honest with you. Now, many are deeming Heretics as a dark horse, right, coming into Division B. And you can look no further than the star player, like I said, the captain of this roster, Lucky to lead the way. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind is that this will be a much different atmosphere for Team Heretics. There is a lot of pressure coming onto this team, and especially with we know how big the Spanish community really is. They're going to be rooting on this team as much as they possibly can. But I think it's fair to say when we saw Heretics close out, right, when we saw them win, when we saw them qualify for the Pro League, the passion behind the ownership, the passion behind the players, just overall, like literally just so incredibly proud of themselves after all the work they've been putting in for years and years to finally come into fruition. It's awesome to see. So I know they're going to be coming at it with a lot of passion, but for me, the main guy to look out for, whether or not they can succeed, whether or not they can be that dark horse, is going to be Lucky for the roster. Next up at number 2, we've got Temp from Splice. Now, this was pretty hard for me because I was thinking about putting Hook in this number 4 spot, but I think Temp, to me, makes a little bit more sense. I think he deserves a little bit more of a spotlight considering how consistent he was at this tournament. So I'm definitely kind of giving Temp the nod in this particular situation. Regardless, Temp at CWL Vegas was lighting it up, right? The SOG in his hands was fantastic. We were seeing next-level Temp gameplay that I don't think we've ever seen before. Like, a lot of people have gone back and said, oh, well, we look at Temp, back in Advanced Warfare, that was really kind of like his best over performance. No, Vegas was insane. Like, his consistency, like we've saw players at this tournament be good in the respawns. We've saw certain players be good in Search and Destroy. Temp, from top to bottom, was consistent and consistently one of the best players and totally affecting his team in a positive way. Hardpoint, he was number 8 with a 1.26. Search and Destroy, he was 13th overall with a 1.27. Control, he was number 6 with a 1.37. And overall, he finished number 4 with a 1.28. I mean, it's hard to point out a weakness. When you look at those numbers, when you look at those stats, it's hard to point out a weakness in Temp's gameplay coming from Vegas. Now, I do have a few questions, though, regarding the lineup, because if not only Temp, but Splice can continue to put up a consistent performance, to have the players still playing the same way that they are, they will be a force. They will be a top team to look out for that could easily contend for a few championships from time to time. And that combo of Jerd entering for Temp is, for me, a match made in heaven. You look at Looney with the IGL in combination with a consistent Aqua, and what seems to be the same accuracy from World War II now into Black Ops 4, at least to a certain extent. This team makes absolute sense, especially with Temp leading the way. The only way I see this team struggling is based on internal problems. We've seen egos get the best of certain rosters already ahead of Black Ops 4 with 5v5. We've seen Luminosity early on in Division A. We saw 100 Thieves pre-roster change, and I think it was Looney actually who did an interview. I don't remember who it was with. It might have been Deserto. But he mentioned heading into Vegas that their team argued more than any other team combined heading into Vegas. Like they were arguing more than everyone else combined together. That's how much this team was kind of arguing, going back and forth about certain decisions going on in the map, maybe even roles to a certain extent. So for me, that can be a little bit of a worrisome situation from time to time, but maybe this team just works in that environment. Time will only tell. But I'm incredibly excited to see how Temp can perform post-Stock 2. Obviously, that was G8 heading into Division A, so I'm curious to see how he can perform, and Splice can continue to be a top contender because he was by far a top 3 player at Vegas with Gunless and Dashy, but it has been a while. The game is much different, and you have to keep in mind that that was over 2 months ago that we were seeing Temp dominate with Splice at Vegas. Next, moving on to number 3, we've got Kismet from Enigma 6. Kismet was a superstar at the PLQ. He led Enigma 6 to a 5-1 record in Pool A, and that was really kind of like heading into the PLQ. Pool A was without question considered the group of death. Like some people were arguing certain situations or certain things. Pool A was considered to be the group of death. So to finish off with a 5-1 record as the last seed is impressive, and he led the way with his stats. He was number 4 overall. He was number 1 in Search and Destroy with a 1.78. He was number 1 in team damage for E6. He was number 1 in engagements per minute for Enigma 6. Each day at the PLQ, I think it was like the analysts who were constantly pointing out, look at Kismet, he's back on the top of the scoreboard. He's back at the top for damage. He's back at the top for KD. And I will tell you this, at Enigma 6, they know how to find talent. They scout. General gives players a chance. He constantly knows how to find the right talent. He knows the right DNA, apparently, because he's housed the talents of Decimate, of Blastful, of Abeezy, Dashy, and now Kismet. And I'll be totally honest with you, as someone who watched him and commentated over Kismet in World War II, when he was on Enter Uprise, when he was on Hydra Gaming, kind of winning tournaments from time to time and seeing some really good performances, I didn't know he had it in him. I really didn't. I mean, there were certain guys who you can kind of point out and say, oh, yeah, that's definitely a guy that you can see. Like, even guys on Midnight, for example. I was kind of pointing out Brack and even Envoy. Like, those guys were very apparent. For me, Kismet, he was a good player, but he wasn't a standout to an overall perspective. Like, he was a great player, but he wasn't by any means someone who was without question on my list to be a 1.78 type KD player in Search and Destroy, number 1 overall, to be a number 4 overall at the PLQ versus some very, very high level teams. But he surprised. He put everyone on notice, including myself, and I love the dynamic of this E6 roster. And if they can continue to work, I think this could be a very, very solid team. You talk about Kismet, General, and Frosty together, along with the great leadership that I think comes through from Diabolic, who I think is going to be a phenomenal support for this team, and isn't necessarily the IGL, but I think can be a great leader out of the game as well, because I think he likes to set up his team. He knows the group that he has with him, and I think this team can absolutely make some noise. But like I said, I think the surgeons that E6 can possibly make all comes from their main man, Mr. Kismet. And in the Pro League for the first time, it's going to be a much different situation for him. I know he doesn't have the greatest overall LAN experience, so this is going to be kind of interesting to see how he does versus hardcore-only pro-type rosters and how he can kind of move forward into events like Fort Worth, etc. Next, at number 2, we've got Arcides from E United. Arcides put up one of the most impressive performances I've seen in a long time at CWL Vegas, the Maddox, but especially the ICR in his hands was incredible, and he put up some numbers that will go down for a while, right? In Hardpoint, he was number 1 with a 1.51, number 7 in Control with a 1.32, number 1 in Respawns with a 1.45, number 3 overall with a 1.35, number 6 in damage per map in Respawns. Another thing that I find incredibly impressive about Arcides is that there's actually a stat tracked from our friends at codstats.gg called team death percentage, which is pretty much the percentage of deaths that you have for your team. So we talk about players that, are super talented. We talk about the Gunlesses of the world, the Temps of the world, the guys who really performed for their teams. And while those KDs are high, a lot of the times when they are constantly in fights, right? They're taking down 1 to 2 players every time before they die, but they die a lot, right? They're constantly, seeing that skull pop up on their screen. They're constantly in the respawn, getting back into the overall setup, but they're there to make an impact. And those guys die, like I said, they die very, very frequently. So when we look at this list, you're going to notice some very talented players on this one. So, like I said, team death percentage, Gunless, number 1. Temp, number 2. Decimate, number 4, who played very well for G2, by the way, at Vegas. Hook, number 8. By the way, the best player for Envy, no question. Arcides was number 33. Now, if that doesn't show you what he's doing around the map, then I don't know what does, because a lot of people are going to immediately point at that stat and say, oh, well, it's because he's an ICR. Well, what's impressive to me is that he is as low on that list as he is at number 33, yet he is one of the best respawn players with guys who are running a SOG and a Maddox at all times. I mean, he's doing it with the weapon that you could argue by no means should be there, and he's staying alive the same way that an ICR typically would. Like, how is he able to put up these numbers despite all the other ICRs having to switch off? We talked about Formal with LG. He needs to switch off of that. There's been a lot of conversations with Rated and Red Reserve. There's been a lot of conversations saying that he should be switching off the ICR and put a Maddox in his hands. I think Arcides is just fine, clearly based off the stats, but can he do it at the PLQ? Another thing that I want to add is that out of the top 4 teams at CWL Vegas, the roster without their best player, so Optic without Dashy, Splice without Temp, Luminosity without Gumless, they all still had a positive KD without their best player. They all still played well without their best player in the lineup. But United without Arcides was the only team in the top 4 that was negative. And that goes to show how influential, how important he is on the map. Now, I've been a big person to talk about United and saying that I think that J-Camp was not the best decision for United to make. I think he was a great player, but I think he should have gone to a 100T Luminosity type roster. And then I think that they're going to have to rely on Arcides a lot for this team kind of moving forward. Like I said, we've started to see other teams swap out the ICR. We've started to see that, hey, maybe they should switch to a Maddox. They have a lot better of a performance with that particular weapon. I think we could see that happen from Arcides. My thing is that, can they back him up? Can you imagine if they were to add a few extra pieces with Arcides' overall fantastic sliding? I think United could be a contender. I think they still are as of this moment. But I think over time, as roles start to change, as weapons start to get tuned out, we could see United start to fall in the standings to an extent. But regardless, I mean, this man put up an insane performance with the ICR at Vegas. Much like Temp, it has been a while since we've seen United play. It's been a little bit over 2 months. How is he doing? He's been known as a grinder, been known as a guy who likes to practice, so I imagine he'll be just fine. But I'm excited to see one of the best in the world and the big-time Arcides himself do it again here in Division B. And finally, at number 1, we have Kenny from 100 Thieves. Recently, 100 Thieves made somewhat of a controversial decision by adding Priesta to the team and adding Pharaoh to the substitute position. Along with Priesta, we also see his teammate coming from FaZe Clan and Crowder. He's going to be now coaching the team to help unite this group of players into an actual roster, into an actual team to an extent. Now, what really sparked a lot of the decisions that 100 Thieves made were the role conversation. Should Octane be the ICR? Should we see Slasher switch to a Maddox? Should Kenny be using the SOG? Should Kenny be taking over Pharaoh in the Maddox position? Regardless of the role conversation, it grew to a point where this team just couldn't work. They just could not work on paper. And with a little bit of extra communication that comes with this team, I think that they are looking so much better now. I think the culture has changed. I think now that Crowder is added to this team that can communicate with Enable, I think Priest is a great communicator as well. He knows a lot about working with Crowder in the past. I think this team is a lot better off. And like I said, I think the roles are going to be a lot more figured out now. I think a lot of the pressure now comes down to really the man who wanted this position. He's the man who kind of sparked the entire roster change. I think everyone else was going to be just fine. But now we're finally giving a little bit of context to the man who finally got what he wanted. 100 Thieves gave Kenny the keys. They said, we'll give this man the benefit of the doubt. And said, Kenny, you don't want to run a SOG? All right, that's fine. Here's the Maddox. Here's the gun that you have been wanting. Here's the weapon you said that you've been needing to get back to your World War II self. And for Kenny, the time is now. For the year, 0.87 in hardpoint. A 0.93 in respawn, a 0.9 overall average isn't going to get the job done. You are the reason the team changed. You are finally going to have what you said you needed to get back to the 3-time champion, the runner-up at champs, the CWL Rookie of the Year, the CWL MVP itself year. Like, you're trying to get back to that state. So, personally, I think 100 Thieves has the capability to be a championship contender. Kenny has what he wanted. He has exactly what he said he needed to get back to his World War II self. Because you have Slasher and Octane, who are two of the best ARs ever. You have Priesta, who looked phenomenal with every weapon in the game. He looked especially great with the SOG, most recently at the PLQ, despite coming into that tournament running an ICR. And by the way, Priesta can also take the main Maddox role if needed, or even a secondary Maddox role if need be. And you have Enable, an IGL that you feel comfortable with if you're Kenny. You've won a championship with him. You know what it's like to be with this guy, and you played well with him in Team Caliber. You were in the trenches with this guy already. This team, to me, can be incredibly scary. But with all things considered, if Kenny can tap back into the same Kenny from World War II that we saw in that particular game, and the roles are back and the players are all back to the way that they should be, this team will be a contender. But that starts with Kenny. Now back in his role, now back with what he wants, and he's got some of the most talented players in the world on this group. If they can all fire together with the new kind of mentality that they have, I think they're going to be just fine. But that all starts with Kenny's role. That can easily be interchanged by someone who was running his role and playing very well at it just a few weeks ago in Priesta. Now, do you agree with my list or do you disagree? Feel free to let us know on Twitter and have your voice be heard by using the hashtag the Esports Dispatch.